She lost everything but a cabin. Then people started watching her. The sizzle of the branding iron against hide smelled like burnt hair and stolen legacy. Prudencio Prasek didn't even flinch at the calf's cry. He handed the smoking iron to a hired hand and turned his immaculate boots toward Lynne. "It's done, Lynne. The Hoppenbrauer brand is dead. The herd, the valley. They belong to the future now." Brandy Roberts leaned against a pristine Range Rover, catching snowflakes on her blood-red fingernails like a bored spectator at a funeral. Lynne dropped her father's silver spurs into the freezing mud. "You bought the dirt, Prudencio," she rasped, her voice like crushed ice. "But the mountain is going to chew you up." She turned her back on her birthright, walking into the howling Montana wind with nothing but a rusty cabin key. The Absaroka Range didn't offer sympathy. It only offered teeth. The heater in Lynne Hoppenbrauer's battered 1998 Ford F250 had died 3 winters ago, leaving her to breathe plumes of white mist as she navigated the treacherous switchbacks away from her erased history. In the cracked side mirror, the 3,000 acres of Hoppenbrauer Ranch, once a thriving testament to her ancestors' sweat, looked like an alien, barren landscape under the encroaching October dusk. 4 generations of bone and blood had been swallowed by the ink of a predatory contract. Now it was the dominion of Prudencio Prasek, a corporate vulture wearing bespoke wool, a man who saw sacred grazing lands as nothing more than future helipads and infinity pools. Prudencio hadn't beaten her fairly. He had manipulated the local bank, bought out her father's outstanding medical debts after his passing, and called the loans in all at once. Alongside him was his fiancée and business partner, Brandy Roberts, a woman whose cruelty was as sharp as her custom Lucchese boots. Brandy had laughed as Lynne packed her meager belongings. "Leave the Pendleton blankets, honey," Brandy had mocked from the porch. "They look better with our new decor." The injustice burned in Lynne's chest like swallowed embers. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, her blue eyes fixed on the winding, treacherous dirt road leading into the crazy mountains. She had lost the cattle, the barn, the heavy equipment, and the ancestral home. The only thing the predatory contracts hadn't swallowed was a 50-acre sliver of vertical rock and timber high on a desolate ridge, along with a rotting, off-grid trapper's cabin built in 1920. It was worthless to a developer like Prudencio. But right now, it was Lynne's entire world. When the truck finally ground to a halt, the silence of the high country was deafening. The cabin was a pathetic sight. The lodgepole pine logs were grey and weathering. The chinking was crumbling into dust, and the tin roof was rusted the colour of dried blood. The front door hung on a single, groaning iron hinge. Lynne stepped out into the knee-deep snow that had already begun to blanket the high elevation. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had a warm hearth to retreat to. Instead, she reached behind the truck seat, pulling out her grandfather's vintage Winchester model 1894 lever-action rifle, a heavy, double-bitted axe, and a cast-iron skillet. For the first few weeks, survival was an agonizing, minute-by-minute battle. The temperature routinely plummeted below 0. Lynne worked until her hands were blistered and bleeding, felling dead timber, patching the roof with salvaged sheet metal, and sealing the drafts with mud and moss. Her diet consisted of canned beans, cooked over a temperamental wood stove, and whatever small game she could manage to harvest. The physical pain was excruciating, a constant, throbbing ache in her lower back and shoulders. But the emotional torment was worse. In the dead of night, the wind whistling through the pines sounded like Prudencio's mocking laughter. She was utterly alone, cast out from society, a ghost haunting the edge of the world. Or so she thought. By mid-November, the deep freeze had set in, turning the Yellowstone River in the valley below into a ribbon of solid white ice. Lynne had adapted to the brutal rhythm of the mountains. She wore a stained Carhartt jacket that smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch, her dark hair chopped short with a hunting knife to keep it out of the way. She was chopping firewood one afternoon, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the granite walls of the canyon, when the hairs on the back of her neck suddenly stood up. It was a primal instinct, honed by weeks of isolation. Someone was watching her. She paused, resting the heavy axe head on a frozen stump. Her eyes scanned the dense tree line of Douglas firs across the clearing. The forest was still, the shadows long and deceptive. She walked slowly toward the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slipped the Winchester from its resting place by the door and racked the lever, the metallic clatter slicing through the silence. "Who's out there?" she shouted, her voice raspy from disuse. Nothing but the wind answered. But the next morning, when she went to check her rabbit snares, she found them. Boot prints. They were large, distinct, with a heavy vibram sole. Not the sleek cowboy boots of Prudencio's hired thugs. The tracks lingered near the edge of her clearing, circling behind a large boulder, as if whoever it was had been standing there for hours just observing. The intrusion sent a spike of paranoia through her. Was it Adrian Dickinson? The corrupt county sheriff had been in Prudencio's pocket for a decade, the very man who had delivered the eviction notice with a smug smile. Lynne began carrying the Winchester everywhere, sleeping with it fully loaded across her chest. Then she found the first gift. It was a cold Tuesday morning. Resting on the chopping block was a tightly bound bundle of fatwood kindling and a small, waterproof tin of Folgers coffee. Beneath the tin was a folded piece of heavy cardstock. Lynne opened it with trembling, calloused fingers. The handwriting was neat, almost architectural. "You swing an axe better than any man in Paradise Valley. Keep the fire burning. D. Dede." The Watcher wasn't an enemy. Over the next few weeks, the phantom presence became a strange source of comfort. Occasionally, Lynne would catch a glimpse of a figure on the far ridge, a man in a heavy parka, carrying what looked like a long, cylindrical object. Not a rifle, a camera lens. Unbeknownst to Lynne, her solitary war for survival against the harsh Montana winter had captivated a rugged freelance wildlife photographer and journalist named Dennis Davies. Dennis had come to the mountains to document the elk migration, but he had found something far more compelling. A woman stripped of everything, refusing to die, carving life out of the unforgiving rock. He wasn't just watching her, he was documenting her, capturing the raw, brutal beauty of her resilience. And soon, he wouldn't be the only one watching. Down in the town of Livingston, 50 miles away, the sanitized narrative Prudencio Prasek had carefully constructed was beginning to crack like thin ice. Prudencio and Brandy had spent the last month hosting lavish galas at the newly rebranded Prasek Estates, boasting to out-of-state investors about their luxurious new development plans. Over glasses of imported champagne, they painted Lynne Hoppenbrauer as a chaotic, financially irresponsible squatter who had thankfully been removed for the economic betterment of the county. But the truth has a funny way of surfacing, usually when it's least expected. Claudia Pritchard, the sharp-eyed town clerk and an old friend of Lynne's late mother, was the first to see it. While sorting through the morning mail at the local post office, she paused over the latest issue of Wilderness Frontier, a prominent national magazine. The cover didn't feature a grizzly bear or an alpine lake. It featured Lynne. Dennis Davies had published a stunning 10-page photo essay and investigative piece titled The Ghost of the Crazies. The images were breathtaking, raw, and undeniably haunting. There was a full-page spread of Lynne silhouetted against a rising blizzard, her axe mid-swing, muscles taut beneath her heavy jacket. Another showed her face close up, smudged with pine soot, her bright blue eyes blazing with an unyielding, feral light that refused to be extinguished. The dilapidated cabin stood behind her, not as a symbol of poverty, but as a fortress against the cruel elements. But Dennis hadn't just showcased her survival. He had laid bare the predatory legal maneuvers that had stolen her land. He detailed the bank's sudden change in policy, the exploitation of her father's medical debts, and the suspicious property transfers authorized by the county. Claudia didn't just read it, she weaponized it. She bought every copy at the local drugstore and left them everywhere. The counter at the Elkhorn Diner, the waiting area of the barber shop, the checkout lane at the hardware store. The reaction was instantaneous. When Prudencio walked into the Elkhorn Diner for his usual Tuesday prime rib lunch, the customary hum of conversation died. Men in Carhartt and dusty boots stared at him with undisguised contempt. The waitress poured his coffee without a word, slamming the mug down so hard the hot liquid spilled over the rim. The whispers turned into a low roar of outrage. Lynne wasn't a failure. She was a martyr, a living embodiment of the old, tough Montana spirit that slick men like Prudencio were trying to pave over. When Prudencio retreated to his newly renovated mansion and saw the magazine sitting on his imported Italian marble countertop, his face contorted with a violent rage. He swept his arm across the island, sending a bowl of fruit and a vase of white lilies crashing to the hardwood floor. "She's making us look like monsters," he screamed at Brandy, pointing a trembling finger at the cover photo. "Half the town council won't return my calls this morning." Brandy casually picked up her wine glass, stepping delicately over the shattered vase. Her eyes narrowed as she studied a close-up photo of Lynne's scarred, dirty hands. "She's a beggar, squatting in a shack, Prudencio. But Davies is turning her into a folk hero. We can't have that." The investors from California are getting skittish. They're asking questions about the land acquisition, about ethics clauses. They don't like bad press, and they certainly don't like investing in a man who looks like a cartoon villain. Prudencio paced the kitchen, a dark, desperate plan forming in his eyes. "That ridge is technically on the border of our property line. There's an old disputed water right attached to that cabin. If we claim she's violating county environmental codes with her outhouse and wood burning, we can get Dickinson to condemn the structure. We burn the shack down as a hazard, force her into the county shelter in Livingston. Once she's in the system, she becomes just another vagrant. Not a hero." He made the call. The next day, Sheriff Adrian Dickinson's cruiser clawed its way up the mountain road, its tires spinning in the deep powder until the snow became too thick to pass. Adrian hiked the final half-mile, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. He found Lynne repairing a makeshift corral she had built from dead wood. "County health and safety violation, Lynne," Adrian said, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine, glittering snow. He didn't look her in the eye as he handed her a laminated document. "This structure is officially condemned by the county. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, or I come back with 3 deputies and drag you out in cuffs. Prudencio sends his regards." Lynne didn't flinch. She took the thick paper, looked Adrian dead in his evasive eyes, and casually dropped it into her roaring campfire. The plastic laminate curled and hissed, sending a toxic puff of black smoke into the air. "You tell Prudencio," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly, gravelly calm, "that he can send his deputies. He can send you. But you better bring body bags. I'm not leaving this mountain." Adrian scoffed, shaking his head and turning away. "You're crazy, woman. "The weather service is calling for a front moving in. You'll freeze to death before the week is out, and I won't even have to do the paperwork." What the corrupt sheriff didn't know was that Dennis Davies had been lying prone in a snowdrift 50 yards away, completely camouflaged. His telephoto lens was whirring, capturing every single frame of the intimidation tactic. 48 hours later, the sky above the crazy mountains didn't just darken, it turned the color of bruised iron. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast, it made Lynne's ears pop. The wildlife had vanished completely, a silent, ominous warning. This wasn't just a storm, it was the arrival of a massive, anomalous winter cyclone, a white death blizzard notorious in deep Montana lore. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single terrifying hour. In her cabin, Lynne didn't panic. She prepared. She spent hours swinging the axe, stockpiling a mountain of chopped lodgepole pine inside the single room until she could barely move around it. She reinforced the heavy wooden door with an extra crossbar, packed the window seams with old rags, and stoked the cast-iron wood stove until its belly glowed a furious cherry red. She had canned beans, melted snow for water, and a loaded Winchester. She was safe. Down in the valley, however, arrogance profoundly blinded her enemies. Prudencio, enraged that his 48-hour deadline had passed and Lynne hadn't fled, decided he wanted the deep, visceral satisfaction of watching her break. Ignoring the frantic, repetitive severe weather warnings echoing across the local radio stations, he, Brandy, and Sheriff Dickinson piled into Prudencio's massive, heavily modified black Ford F250. "We go up there, we kick the damn door off its hinges, and we arrest her for trespassing and resisting," Prudencio barked, turning on the heated leather seats and gripping the heated steering wheel. "I want her out before the snow gets too deep. I want her walking down the mountain in the cold so she knows exactly who owns her." "It'll be a beautiful sight," Brandy purred, checking her reflection in the visor mirror and adjusting her designer cashmere scarf. "Make sure you handcuff her tightly, Adrian. I want to see her struggle." Adrian grunted from the back seat, clearly uneasy, but unwilling to bite the hand that fed his offshore bank accounts. They drove past the flashing Orange County warning barriers, the heavy, studded tires of the truck chewing confidently through the rising drifts. But nature does not care about wealth, and the mountains do not respect authority. 3 miles up the treacherous, winding logging road, the storm hit them not with a flurry, but with an apocalyptic fury. Winds exceeding 70 miles per hour blasted the side of the truck, rocking the 3-ton vehicle like a child's toy. A total, blinding whiteout swallowed them instantly. The headlights reflected off a solid wall of swirling ice, reducing visibility to absolute zero. "I can't see the road," Prudencio yelled, raw panic finally piercing his arrogant, corporate facade. His hands tightened on the wheel. "Just keep going! Don't stop here!" Brandy screamed, gripping the leather dashboard, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the upholstery. Suddenly, the ground simply gave way beneath the passenger-side tires. The F250 had hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath a deceptive powder drift on a steep curve. The heavy vehicle careened off the edge of the embankment. Prudencio stomped on the brakes, but there was no traction. With a sickening crunch of metal against timber, the truck crashed through a stand of young pines, rolling twice down the steep grade before slamming violently into the immovable trunk of a massive, ancient Douglas fir. The airbags deployed with a deafening crack, filling the cabin with white powder and the acrid smell of burnt chemicals. For a long moment, there was nothing but the shrieking of the wind outside. When the hissing of the ruptured radiator faded, the true, agonizing horror of their situation settled over them. The engine was completely dead. The heater was off, and the brutal cold immediately began seeping through the shattered windows. Adrian groaned from the back, clutching his right arm, which was bent at a grotesque angle. Brandy was weeping hysterically, a jagged gash on her forehead, leaking warm blood down her face. Prudencio frantically pushed the buttons on his expensive satellite phone, holding it up to the broken windshield, only to find the signal completely dead. "We have to walk," Adrian gasped through clenched teeth, his face pale with shock. "If we stay in this metal box, we'll be dead by morning. The temperature is dropping to 30 below zero." "Walk where?" Brandy shrieked, looking down at her custom leather boots and thin designer coat, wholly inadequate for the brutal elements. "We'll die out there." Prudencio kicked his jammed door open, the wind nearly tearing it from its hinges. He looked up the mountain through the swirling vortex of the blizzard. There, cutting through the absolute darkness, a tiny, faint orange light flickered in the distance. It was the glow of a kerosene lantern in the window of a dilapidated 1920s cabin. "To her," Prudencio whispered, the words tasting like ash and defeat in his mouth. "We have to go to Lynne." The journey up the ridge was not a hike, it was a descent into hell. Every single step through the waist-deep snow was an agonizing battle against the elements. The wind howled through the canyon, feeling like 1,000 invisible razors slicing into their exposed skin. Within the first 100 yards, Brandy lost one of her expensive Lucchese boots in a deep snowdrift. She wailed in pure terror as the freezing moisture soaked through her silk sock. Frostbite immediately began to consume her foot, turning her toes numb, then painfully burning, then completely dead. Prudencio, his expensive Stetson long blown away into the dark, dragged her by the arm. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling shattered glass, his leg muscles cramping with every desperate lunge forward. Adrian stumbled behind them, hyperventilating, holding his shattered arm tightly against his chest to keep it from jostling. It took them 2 excruciating hours to cover less than a quarter of a mile. By the time they finally breached the clearing, they were barely recognizable as human beings. They were frozen, gasping animals driven only by the primal, desperate urge to survive. Prudencio fell heavily onto the small wooden porch, his bloody, frost-covered hands desperately pounding on the heavy oak door. "Lynne, open the door, please!" he sobbed, the violent wind stealing his voice and tossing it into the dark. "We're dying out here. Help us!" Inside the cabin, Lynne was sitting in her grandfather's rocking chair by the roaring fire, methodically oiling the action of her Winchester. She heard the faint, desperate thumping over the roar of the storm. At first, she thought it was a desperate black bear trying to find shelter. But then she heard the faint, pathetic cry of a human voice. She walked slowly to the door, slid the heavy iron deadbolt back, and pulled it open, bracing herself against the blast of freezing wind. The sight before her was biblical in its poetic justice. The arrogant millionaire who had stolen her life, the cruel woman who had mocked her heritage, and the corrupt sheriff who had threatened her freedom were crawling at her feet. They were covered in snow, ice, and snot, literally begging for mercy on the porch of the only home they hadn't managed to steal. "Please," Brandy wept, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. She clutched at the hem of Lynne's stained Carhartt pants with a trembling, blue hand. "I'm freezing to death. Please let us in." Lynne looked down at them, her face an unreadable mask of hardened stone. The power she held in that moment was absolute. She could close the door. She could lock it, sit by her warm fire, drink her coffee, and let the mountain solve all her problems. No one would ever blame her. The authorities would simply call it a tragedy of the storm. It would be the ultimate, cleanest vengeance. She stared into Prudencio's terrified, desperate eyes. She saw the pathetic smallness of the man when stripped of his money, his lawyers, and his corporate power. Out here, His bank accounts meant absolutely nothing. Out here, she was a queen, and he was a peasant begging for a spark of warmth. "Leave your pride on the porch," Lynne said coldly, her voice cutting through the wind. She took one step back and gestured inside with the barrel of the rifle. "Get in." They practically scrambled over each other to get over the threshold, collapsing in a pathetic heap near the wood stove, weeping uncontrollably as the intense heat hit their frozen bodies. Lynne didn't offer them her chair. She didn't offer them a cup of hot water. She kicked 2 old moth-eaten wool blankets onto the dirt floor next to them. "Wrap up. Do not touch the stove," Lynne commanded. She walked back to her rocking chair, sat down, and rested the Winchester across her lap, her eyes never leaving them. For the next 12 hours, the 3 of them huddled on the hard dirt floor like beaten dogs, shivering and groaning in pain. And for 12 hours, the woman they had systematically tried to destroy watched over them, her spirit unbroken, her dominance absolute. The silence inside the cabin was heavier than the snow falling outside. Prudencio stared at the dirt floor, the crushing realization washing over him. He was drawing breath entirely because of the mercy of the woman he had wronged. His humiliation was total, absolute, and burned hotter than the fire. The tempest broke on the morning of the 3rd day. The howling wind that had battered the cabin for 48 hours ceased as suddenly as if a massive hand had smothered it. In its place came a profound, crystalline silence. When Lynne pushed open the heavy oak door, the sunlight hitting the 5-foot snowdrifts was so brilliant it burned the eyes. The crazy mountains had been scrubbed clean, transformed into a pristine, silent wonderland of blinding white and sapphire sky. Inside, the 3 interlopers remained huddled on the floor, too broken to move, too ashamed to speak. Their expensive clothes were ruined, stained with soot, dirt, and their own terror. The silence of the morning was shattered by a low, rhythmic thumping echoing up the canyon. It grew louder, vibrating in the chest, the distinct thwack, thwack, thwack of a heavy rotor. A Montana Highway Patrol search and rescue helicopter crested the jagged ridge, its downwash whipping the fresh snow into a miniature blizzard as it hovered, then carefully touched down in the clearing Lynne had meticulously carved out all autumn. Paramedics in high-visibility gear piled out, but they weren't alone. State troopers in heavy winter uniforms followed close behind, their expressions grim. And stepping out of the rotor wash behind them was a tall man in a heavy parka, a complex camera rig slung over his shoulder. Dennis Davies. He had weathered the storm in his own fortified sub-zero camp miles away and had managed to patch an emergency signal through his satellite uplink the moment the weather cleared. As the paramedics rushed the cabin to tend to the frozen, whimpering trio on the floor, the rescue quickly transformed into a reckoning. Prudencio's nightmare, it turned out, was only just beginning. While they had been trapped on the mountain, Dennis's article had not just gone viral, it had ignited a wildfire. Utilizing his deep connections as a former investigative reporter, Dennis had preemptively dumped a massive cache of public records, banking anomalies, and hidden emails directly to the State Attorney General and the FBI. The evidence of illegal collusion between Prudencio's development firm, the local bank, and Sheriff Adrian Dickinson was undeniable. While Prudencio was shivering in the dirt of Lynne's cabin, federal authorities had been raiding the luxurious offices of Prasek Estates in Livingston. "Get me to a hospital, and get my lawyers on the phone," Prudencio croaked, trying to muster a shred of his former authority as a paramedic wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders. "Do you know who I am?" A state trooper stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Prasek," the trooper said coldly. He grabbed Prudencio's frostbitten wrists, ignoring the man's scream of pain, and clicked the cuffs shut. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it. You're under arrest for federal fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy." Prudencio's face drained of whatever color the cold hadn't already stolen. He looked desperately at Brandy. But Brandy, hobbling on heavily bandaged, blackened feet, wouldn't even meet his eye. A federal agent had already approached her near the helicopter door, and she was whispering frantically, calculating exactly how much she needed to confess to secure immunity, selling Prudencio out before the rotors even spun up for the return trip. Sheriff Dickinson, clutching his broken arm, was read his rights right next to her, weeping openly in the snow. Before the helicopter lifted off with its disgraced cargo, Dennis Davies hiked up the snowy path to the porch. He stopped a few feet from Lynne, lowering his camera. He extended a warm, calloused hand. "You're quite the survivor, Miss Hoppenbrower," Dennis said, his voice deep and rough. "The whole country is talking about you right now." Lynne looked at his hand, then up into his eyes. A small, genuine smile, the first one to touch her face in what felt like a lifetime, cracked the hard, weathered lines of her expression. She took his hand in a firm grip. "I just kept the fire burning, Mr. Davies. Like you said, in the months that followed the great storm, Karma finished its brutal, meticulous work. Prudencio Prasek's financial empire collapsed entirely under the weight of federal indictments. Stripped of his assets to pay massive restitution, he was sentenced to a decade in a federal penitentiary. Adrian Dickinson joined him. Brandy Roberts avoided jail time, but was bankrupted by civil suits and slunk out of Montana, permanently disgraced. Without Prudencio's corrupt money backing it, the bank was forced to forfeit the Hoppenbrower Ranch. The state put the 3,000 acres up for public auction. They didn't expect the army that arrived to buy it. A GoFundMe campaign, started by Claudia Pritchard and fueled by the unrelenting national momentum of Dennis's viral article, had raised over $3 million in a matter of weeks. Donations poured in from people across the globe, from farmers in Iowa to office workers in Tokyo, who were profoundly inspired by Lynne's grit and her refusal to break. On a bright morning in May, Lynne walked into the county courthouse and bought her family's land back in cash. Her first act as the rightful owner was to hook a heavy logging chain to the bumper of her battered F250, wrap it around the gaudy, wrought-iron Prasek Estates sign at the valley entrance, and tear it out of the earth, leaving it to rust in the ditch. But Lynne didn't move back into the sprawling, hollow main house in the valley. The mountain had changed her. Instead, she hired a local crew to fully restore and expand the off-grid trapper's cabin on the ridge, turning it into a beautiful, sturdy, timber-framed home that commanded a view of the entire valley. By autumn, the Hoppenbrower brand was alive again. Lynne stood on her expansive new porch, holding a steaming mug of Folgers coffee, watching a newly purchased herd of Black Angus cattle graze in the golden pastures far below. Beside her stood Dennis, who had permanently traded his nomadic life for the deep roots of Paradise Valley. Lynne had lost everything to the greed of lesser men. But in the agonizing fire of that loss, she had forged an unbreakable soul. And when she looked down at the valley now, she didn't see the ghost of what was taken from her. She saw the undeniable, beautiful reality of what she had conquered. I hope you enjoyed this dramatic story of survival, justice, and the indomitable human spirit. If Lynne's incredible journey of facing down arrogant enemies and letting karma do its heavy lifting inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to the video. In real life, we all face moments where it feels like everything has been taken from us by unfair circumstances or difficult people. Lynne's story reminds us that while others can take our material possessions, they can never steal our inner strength, our resilience, or our spine. When you are pushed to the absolute edge, Keep your fire burning. Show mercy when it's hardest. Hold your ground. And trust that karma and truth always find their way through the storm. Let Lynne's grit remind you to stand tall in your own life today.